Here's Todd Friel to overestimate how convincing his biblical hermeneutics are to atheists.
What other holy book would be as honest as Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, if this event didn't happen, forget about it? I'm paraphrasing, of course. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the linchpin miracle in the Bible. Perhaps you're thinking, well, what about the incarnation? When Jesus Christ, God, became flesh, the problem with saying that's the linchpin miracle is you can't look at a baby and know that the miracle happened. You would say, well, his life testifies that he is God. I would agree to that. But the incarnation cannot really be observed, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ can, and it was.
Well, according to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' resurrection wasn't the only resurrection to be observed. Matthew says that after Jesus was crucified, the bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming forth from their tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. This isn't mentioned in any of the other Gospels. Isn't that kind of weird? You'd think the other Gospel authors, if they were really eyewitnesses, would have noticed this and considered it worth mentioning. Also, if Jesus' resurrection is evidence that he's God, does that mean that all of these other guys were God too? If the resurrection of these other guys isn't evidence that they are God, then how is Jesus' resurrection evidence that he's God?
Your entire life, your eternity is riding on this miracle, but we need to do some math. How do we even know about this miracle? Well, there was a book written about it. It's called the Bible, and that means you and I are relying on some eyewitnesses to be telling the truth.
No, we're not. We're relying on the gospel authors who were anonymous, so we can't know that they were eyewitnesses. And given the literacy of those authors, they are unlikely to be the kind of regular folks who were hanging around Jesus in that time and place. Also, these stories weren't written down until decades after the fact, which further reduces the probability of the authors being eyewitnesses. We're also relying on Paul, who was definitely not an eyewitness. At best, we are relying on people claiming to speak for eyewitnesses.
How do we know? You'll hear this slanderous accusation when you witness on university campuses. Well, other books get people to believe a lie. There's people who have been charlatans. What about Jim Jones? Valid point, but that is why we need to dig deep into these eyewitness biblical accounts. And what we are going to see is something unique from every other myth story.
I doubt that this is true, but it's also irrelevant. Not every false story is a myth story. I think the most probable explanation for Paul's letters and the Gospels is that Jesus was a real guy and some of the things that happened to him were accurately described, but also there were embellishments, misperceptions, and misunderstandings.
Let's dive in to our eyewitness accounts to see if indeed they are something that can be trusted. From Nathan Buznitz, the written eyewitness accounts were in circulation much too early to be a myth. This is huge. Why? Because if they had been written much later, all that time, people could have concocted stories. But when the eyewitness accounts were written near the event, there are people who could have busted the authors. Hey, he didn't rise from the dead. Everybody in Jerusalem knows that. But our eyewitness accounts were written close enough to the actual events. And guess what? Nobody said, you're fibbing.
Well, nobody whose writings we have said that, and anybody who was of that opinion would be claiming an unprovable negative. If some folks say they saw Jesus after he died, and you didn't see Jesus, that wouldn't really be proof that the folks who claim they did aren't telling the truth. So all the folks who didn't see Jesus had no way of proving, or even necessarily knowing, that the folks who said they did were fibbing.
A myth cannot be developed when people who can refute it are still alive.
Nonsense. There are plenty of myths that people believe about events that happened within our lifetimes. This kind of thing happens even now when you can find a debunking of every goofy conspiracy theory, and yet they persist. Tall tales were especially easy to spread back then due to the fact that there was no Snopes in the first century.
Number 2, many witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in about AD 55, give or take.
And many of them were illiterate and couldn't write down their objections. And even those who were literate wouldn't necessarily have heard all of Paul's claims. Even so, we do in fact have a record of disagreement between Paul and Jesus' followers. Those records come from Paul himself. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul says that Peter and James opposed his take on how Christianity ought to be practiced. Specifically, Paul disagreed with the idea that you need to be circumcised to be a Christian, despite the fact that the living eyewitness to Jesus' life opposed how Paul wished Christianity to proceed. His way eventually won out. If Paul can get away with contradicting Jesus' living followers on that doctrine, what other doctrines could he have gotten away with inventing?
Number 3, many witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote Galatians in AD 49, and he certainly talks about Christ rising from the dead.
He also talks about the living followers of Jesus calling him on his BS about circumcision.
Number 4, a myth requires 2 or more generations to pass before it can take root.
Where do you even get this idea? Citations sorely needed. And even if myths require that amount of time, not all falsehoods do.
And finally, number 5, the best scholarship suggests the Synoptic Gospels were written within 30 years of Calvary.
Which is more than enough time for a game of telephone to add all kinds of embellishments.
All that to say, the people who wrote these accounts claim to have seen them.
No, they didn't. Clearly not everything the Gospels describe is claimed to have been seen by the authors. For example, the stories of the empty tomb don't indicate that the Gospel authors were there themselves at all. Mark was the first Gospel to describe the discovery of the empty tomb, and it only says that the folks who found it were women. He also bizarrely claims in Mark 16:8 that these women told nobody about their discovery, which makes one wonder how the Gospel author found out about it. Later Gospels add weird and inconsistent details about the tomb. Matthew says that there were guards at the tomb, which is odd because what was the point of guarding a tomb? Did the Romans provide tomb guarding service to everyone they crucified? And if there were guards at the tomb to keep people from robbing it, why didn't they stop Jesus when he walked out of it? What kind of guards let a guy who was supposed to be executed just get up and walk away?
Furthermore, the details that are given are so rich
and so inconsistent.
Anytime somebody makes up a myth, you see, this guy he died and then he wasn't dead anymore. And they can be extremely vague. Why? Because you can't get busted. But when you've got a lot of details, that tells the reader, either they are a really intricate liar or this really happened.
And with respect to claims about a dude coming back from the dead, which of those two explanations do you think is most probable?
First century fiction was not written in today's style of realistic narrative. There is no mistaking ancient myth with real history because ancient fiction never wasted time on unnecessary details that didn't drive the plot or promote a character's development.
And not all false stories are written in the style of fiction. If you want people to believe in a story, wouldn't you actively avoid any style of writing typical of fiction?
Go ahead and read any one of the mythological accounts of some sort of divine human being, and they do not have the specificity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ in 4 accounts.
Well, there aren't really 4 distinct accounts. There's the Gospel of Mark and the Q document, and there are the rest, which largely copy and expand upon Mark and Q.
That should give you confidence. This is too detailed from individuals who wrote the accounts too near the event for it to be a myth. More from Dr. Booznitz. Mark 4:38, he cites, Jesus himself was in the stern asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He was in the stern on a cushion. Why the detail? Oh yeah, because they were there.
Or they were reporting the story of someone who was there, or more likely, this detail was an embellishment.
And they knew the details. Verse number 2, that is an example, is John 21:8. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. Or consider John 21:11. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Who would know that there were 153 fish? Oh yeah, an eyewitness who is telling the truth.
Or someone who heard a story passed down from an eyewitness, or someone who heard a story in which that detail was embellished. Let's say it was an eyewitness, though, and that this detail is accurate. Does that mean that all of the details were accurate? Obviously not.
But there is more reliability to the eyewitness accounts. The written eyewitness accounts are too self-debasing and counterproductive to be a myth. Imagine you desired to be rich and famous and to have a lot of followers, and you were willing to write down details of your experiences following a poor Nazarene around Israel. Would you describe yourself as a buffoon?
This assumes that the motivation of the gospel authors was fame and fortune, as though those are the only possible motivations for embellishing a story. Sometimes stories just get embellished to make them more interesting. That's not necessarily the right explanation for the descriptions of miracles in the Gospels, but it's certainly more plausible than the notion that those miracles actually happened.
And yet, that is exactly what we read all throughout the New Testament. Authors of eyewitness events made themselves look foolish because they had actually behaved foolishly. Why would anybody who is desiring to trick people or to have them send in their tithes so that they can receive some sort of tchotchke so that they could fly around on a private jet? Okay, I'm getting my centuries confused, but you get the point. A charlatan tries to make himself look wonderful. The eyewitness accounts you read in the New Testament, they didn't look so stellar. 8 examples of this. Number 1, John never mentioning his own name anywhere in his gospel, instead referring to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Which is a good reason to disbelieve that it was actually written by John the disciple. Many modern New Testament scholars do disbelieve that John the disciple was the author.
Trying to get rich, you don't do that. Number 2, Peter's courtyard failure at Jesus' trial, where he denied knowing Jesus 3 times.
Well, Peter didn't write the Gospels, so the principle of embarrassment holds less weight with respect to descriptions of the embarrassing things he did.
Number 3, the frequent bickering and pettiness among Jesus' closest disciples. They look like the Stooges. Number 4, Jesus never taking a side on political issues.
I guess that depends on what you consider a political issue, but it seems to me that when someone asked Jesus about whether it's lawful to pay taxes to the emperor, and Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's," I think you have to rather absurdly narrow the definition of political to exclude that as an example of political commentary.
5, Jesus asking the Father that he might be spared the cup of his suffering, a tricky detail. Number 6, Jesus asking the Father why he had forsaken him.
Both of those passages are evidence that Jesus and the Father are distinct entities. I'll accept that their inclusion is inconvenient to the folks who want us to believe that Jesus is God, and that this makes their occurrence more plausible, but it also makes the idea that Jesus is God less plausible.
An appeal to a woman's testimony, which in those days was not admissible in court.
Well, Mark explicitly says that they didn't give any testimony. They found an angel in Jesus' tomb who told them that Jesus had risen from the dead and that they should go and tell the apostles. But Mark says they ignored this instruction and told nobody. Then later Gospels said that Peter came by and saw the empty tomb.
All of these details would not be included if it were a lie.
I doubt that this is true, but even if it were not a lie, lies are not the only kind of falsehood.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.